Page 59, Chapter 3. The power of society to guide our attitudes on social issues such as abortion. Is how we feel about abortion as personal an opinion as we may think? If we compare the attitudes of people around the world, we see remarkable variation from country to country. People living in Sweden, for example, claim that abortion is almost always justified. People living in Colombia, by contrast, almost never support this procedure. For people living in the United States, abortion is an issue on which public opinion is fairly evenly divided. By making such global comparisons, we see that society guides people's attitudes on various issues, which is a part of the way of life we call culture. Chapter Overview. This chapter focuses on the concept of culture, which refers to a society's entire way of life. Notice that the root of the word culture is the same as that of the word cultivate, suggesting that people living together in a society actually grow their way of life over time. Minjing Li is intently studying the computer screen when his wife, Su Bing, pulls up a chair. "I'm trying to finish organizing our investments," Minjing explains, speaking in Korean. "I didn't realize that we could do that online in our own language." Su Bin says, reading the screen, "That's great. I like it a lot." Minjing and Su Bin are not alone in feeling this way. Back in 1990, executives of Charles Schwab and Company, a large investment brokerage corporation, gathered at the company headquarters in San Fran to discuss ways to expand their business. They came up with the idea that the company would profit by giving greater attention to increasing cultural diversity of the United States. Pointing to the data collected by the U.S. Census Bureau, they saw that the number of Asian Americans was rising rapidly, not just in San Fran, but all over the country. The data also showed that Asian Americans, on average, were doing pretty well financially. That's still true, with more than half of today's Asian American families earning more than $76,000 a year. At the 1990 meeting, Schwab's leaders decided to launch a diversity initiative, assigning 3 executives to work on building awareness of the company among Asian Americans. The program really took off, and today Schwab employs more than 300 people who speak Korean, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, or some other Asian language. Having account executives who speak languages other than English is smart because research shows that most immigrants who come to United States prefer to communicate in their first language, especially when dealing with more important matters such as investing their money. In addition, the company has launched websites using Korean, Chinese, and other Asian languages. Minjing Jun and Subin Li are 2 of millions of people who have open accounts with companies that reach out to them in their own language, in a language other than English. Schwab now manages a significant share of the investments made by Asian Americans, who spent about $325 billion in 2013. So any company would do well to follow the lead Schwab has taken. Other ethnic and racial categories that represent even larger markets in the United States are African American, spending more than $580 billion, and Hispanics, $687 billion. Businesses like Schwab have learned that the United States is most multicultural nation of all. This cultural diversity reflects the country's long history of receiving immigrants from all over the world. The ways of life found around the world differ, not only in language and forms of dress, but also in preferred foods, musical tastes, family patterns, and beliefs about what's right or wrong. Some of the world's people have many children, while others have few. Some honor the elderly, while others seem to glorify youth. Some societies are peaceful, while others are warlike, and societies around the world embrace 1,000 different religious beliefs, as well as particular ideas about what is polite and rude, beautiful and ugly, pleasant and repulsive. This amazing human capacity for many different ways of life is a matter of human culture. What is culture? Explain development of culture as a human strategy for survival. Culture is the ways of thinking, the ways of acting, and the material objects that together form a people's way of life. Culture includes what we think, how we act, and what we own. Culture is both our link to the past and our guide to the future. To understand all that culture is, we must consider both thoughts and things. Non-material culture is the ideas created by members of a society, ideas that range from art to Zen. So non-material culture, which is a definition word, non-material culture is the ideas created by members of society, ideas that range from art to Zen. Material culture, by contrast, is the physical things created by members of society, everything from armchairs to zippers. Culture shapes not only what we do, but also what we think and how we feel, elements of what we commonly but wrongly describe as human nature. The warlike Yanomamo of the Brazilian rainforests think aggression is natural, but halfway around the world the Semi of Malaysia live quite peacefully. The cultures of the United States and Japan both stress achievement and hard work, but members of our society value individualism more than the Japanese, who value collective harmony. Given the extent of cultural differences in the world and people's tendency to view their own way of life as natural, it is no wonder that travelers often find themselves feeling uneasy as they enter an unfamiliar culture. This uneasiness is culture shock, personal disorientation when experiencing an unfamiliar way of life. So that's a definition. This uneasiness, feeling uneasy as they enter an unfamiliar culture, the personal disorientation when experiencing an unfamiliar way of life is called culture shock. People can experience culture shock right here in the United States when, say, African Americans explore an Iranian neighborhood in Los Angeles, college students venture into the Amish countryside in Ohio, or New Yorkers travel through small towns in the Deep South. But culture shock is most intense when we travel abroad. The Thinking Globally box tells the story of a researcher from the United States as he makes his first visit to the home of the Yanomamo, living in the Amazon region of the South America. Page 63, Thinking Globally, confronting the Yanomamo, the experience of culture shock. A small aluminum motorboat chugged steadily along the muddy Orinoco River, deep within the South America's vast tropical rainforest. The anthropologist Napoleon Cagnon was near the end of a 3-day journey to the home territory of the Yanomamo, one of the most technologically simple societies on Earth. Some 12,000 Yanomamo live in villages scattered along the border of Venezuela and Brazil. Their way of life could not be more different than from our own. The Yanomamo wear little clothing and live without electricity, automobiles, cell phones, and other conveniences most people in America and the United States take for granted. Their traditional weapon, used for hunting and warfare, is the bow and arrow. Since most of the Yanomamo knew little about the outside world, Cagnon would be strange to them as they would be to him. By 2 in the afternoon, Cagnon had almost reached his destination. The heat and humidity were becoming unbearable. He was soaked with perspiration, and his face and hands swelled from the bites of gnats swarming around him. But he hardly noticed, so excited was he that in just a few moments he would be face to face with people unlike any he had ever known. Cagnon's heart pounded as the boat slid onto the riverbank. He and his guide climbed from the boat and headed toward the sounds of a nearby village, pushing their way through the dense undergrowth. Cagnon describes what happened next. I looked up and gasped when I saw a dozen burly, naked, sweaty, hideous men staring down at us, down the shafts of their drawn arrows. Immense wads of green tobacco were stuck between their lower teeth and lips, making them look even more hideous, and strands of dark green slime dripped or hung from their nostrils. strands so long they clung to their chest or drizzled down to their chins. My next discovery was that there were a dozen or so vicious, underfed dogs snapping at my legs, circling me as if I were to be their next meal. I just stood there holding my notebook, helpless and pathetic. Then the stench of the decaying vegetation and filth hit me, and I almost got sick. I was horrified. What kind of welcome was this for the person who came to live here with you and learn your way of life, to become friends with you? Fortunately for Cagnon, the Yanomamo villagers recognized his guide and lowered their weapons. Though reassured that he would survive the afternoon, Cagnon was still shaken by his inability to make sense of the people surrounding him, and this was going to be his home for the next year and a half. He wondered why he had given up physics to study human culture in the first place. What do you think? Can you think of an experience of your own similar to the one described here? Explain what happened. Do you think you ever caused culture shock in others? What did you learn from this experience? Why is it difficult for people who live within a different culture systems to interact without discomfort? At the same time, are there benefits gained from doing so? Going back to page 62, I will continue. Hold on. This is an entry, what I believe is from Napoleon Cagnon. January 2nd. High in the Andes Mountains of Peru, here in the rural highlands, people are poor and depend on one another. The culture is built on cooperation among family members and neighbors who have lived nearby for many generations. Today we spent an hour watching a new house being constructed. A young couple had invited their friends and family, who arrived about 6:30 in the morning, and right away they began building. By mid-afternoon, most of the work was finished, and the couple then provided a large meal, drinks, and music that continued for the rest of the day. Seems to be just an entry. I'm not quite sure if it's related to Cagnon or whatever his name is. No particular way of life is natural to humanity, even though most humans around the world view their behavior that way. The cooperative spirit that comes naturally in small communities high in the Andes Mountains of Peru is different from the very competitive living that comes naturally to many people in, say, Chicago or New York City. Such variations come from the fact that as human beings, we join together to create our own way of life. Every other animal, from ants to zebras, behaves very much the same all around the world because behavior is guided by instincts, biological programming over which the species has no control. A few animals, notably chimpanzees and related primates, have the capacity for limited culture, as researchers have noted by observing them using tools and teaching simple skills to their offspring. But the creative power of humans is far greater than any other form of life and has resulted in countless ways of being human. In short, only humans rely on culture rather than instinct to create a way of life and ensure our survival. To understand how human culture came to be, we need to look back at the history of our species. Scientists tell us that our planet is 4.5 billion years old. Life appeared about 1 billion years later. Fast forward another 2 to 3 billion years and we find dinosaurs ruling Earth. It was after these creatures disappeared some 65 million years ago that our history took a crucial turn with the appearance of the animals we call primates. The importance of primates is that they have the largest brains relative to the body size of all living creatures. About 12 million years ago, primates began to evolve along two different lines, setting humans apart from the great apes, our closest relatives. Some 5 million years ago, our distant human ancestors climbed down from the trees of Central Africa to move about in the tall grass. There, walking upright, they learned the advantages of hunting in groups and made use of fire, tools, and weapons, built simple shelters, and fashioned basic clothing. These Stone Age achievements may be modest, but they mark the point at which our ancestors set off a distinct evolutionary course. making culture their primary strategy for survival. By about 25,000 years ago, our own species, Homo sapiens, Latin for intelligent persons, had finally emerged. Humans continue to evolve so that by about 40,000 years ago, people who looked more or less like us roamed the planet. With larger brains, these modern Homo sapiens developed culture rapidly, as the wide range of tools and cave art from this period suggests. About 12,000 years ago, the founding of permanent settlements and the creation of specialized occupations in the Middle East, today's Iraq and Egypt, marked the birth of civilization. About this point, the biological forces we call instincts had mostly disappeared, replaced by a more efficient survival scheme, fashioning the natural environment for ourselves. Ever since, humans have made and remade their world in countless ways, resulting in today's fascinating cultural diversity. The term culture calls to mind other similar terms, such as nation and society, although each has a slightly different meaning. Culture refers to a shared way of life. A nation is a political entity, a territory with designated borders such as the U.S., Canada, Peru, or Zimbabwe. Society, the topic of Chapter 4, is the organized interaction of the people who typically live in a nation or some other specific territory. The United States, then, is both a nation and society, but with many nations, including the U.S., are multicultural, that is, their people follow various ways of life that blend and sometimes clash. Heading: How many cultures? Page 64. In the U.S., how many cultures are there? The best way to identify a number of cultures is to count the number of languages. The Census Bureau lists 382 languages spoken in this country. Almost half of them are native languages, which with the rest brought by immigrants from nations around the world. Globally, experts document more than 7,000 languages, suggesting the existence of just as many distinct cultures. Yet, with the number of languages spoken around the world declining, about 4,000 of the world's languages now are spoken by fewer than 10,000 people. Experts expect that the coming decades may see the disappearance of hundreds of languages, and perhaps half of the world's languages may even disappear before the end of the century. Languages on the endangered list include Gula, Pennsylvania German, and Pawnee, all spoken in the United States. Han, spoken in northwestern Canada. Oro, spoken in Amazon region of Brazil. Sardinian, spoken on the European island of Sardinia. Aramaic, the language of Jesus of Nazareth, still spoken in the Middle East. Nushu, a language spoken in southern China that is the only one to be used exclusively by women. And Waka Waka, as well as other Aboriginal tongues spoken in Australia. As you might expect, when a language is becoming extinct, the last people to speak it are the oldest members of a society. What accounts for the worldwide decline in the number of spoken languages? The main reason is globalization itself, including high technology communication, increasing international migration, and the expanding worldwide economy. Heading: The elements of culture. Identify common elements of culture. Although cultures vary greatly, they all have common elements, including symbols, language, values, and norms. We begin our discussion with one that is the basis for all others, symbols. Like all creatures, humans use their senses to experience the surrounding world, but unlike others, we also try to give the world meaning. Humans transform the elements of the world into symbols. A symbol is anything that carries a particular meaning recognized by people who share a culture. A word, a whistle, a wall covered with graffiti, A flashing red light, a raised fist, all serve as symbols. We can see the human capacity to create and manipulate symbols reflected in the very different meanings associated with the simple act of winking an eye, which can convey interest, understanding, or insult. Societies create new symbols all the time. The Seeing Sociology in Everyday Life box describes some of the cyber symbols that have developed along with our increasing use of computers for communication. We are so dependent on culture's symbols that we take them for granted. We become keenly aware of the importance of a symbol when someone uses it in an unconventional way, as when a person burns a U.S. flag during a political demonstration. Entering an unfamiliar culture also reminds us of the power of symbols. Culture shock is really the inability to read meanings in strange surroundings. Not understanding the symbols of a culture leaves a person feeling lost and isolated, unsure of how to act, and sometimes frightened. Culture shock is a two-way process. On one hand, travelers experience culture shock when encountering people whose way of life is different. For example, North Americans who consider dogs beloved household pets might be put off by the Maasai of Eastern Africa who ignore dogs and never feed them. The same travelers might be horrified to find places that in parts of Indonesia and the People's Republic of China, people roast dogs for dinner. On the other hand, a traveler may inflict culture shock on local people by acting in ways that offend them. A North American who asks for a steak in an Indian restaurant may unknowingly offend Hindus who consider cows sacred and never to be eaten. Global travel provides almost endless opportunities for this kind of misunderstanding. Symbolic meanings also vary with a single society. To some people in the United States, a fur coat represents a prized symbol of success, but to others, it represents an inhumane treatment of animals. In the debate about flying the Confederate flag over South Carolina State House a few years ago, some people saw the flag as a symbol of regional pride, but others saw it as a symbol of racial oppression. Heading: Language, Chapter 3, page 66. All illness in infancy left Helen Keller blind and deaf. Without these two senses, she was cut off from the symbolic world, and her social development was greatly limited. Only when her teacher, Anne Mansfield Sullivan, broke through Keller's isolation using sign language did Helen Keller begin to realize her human potential. This remarkable woman, who later became a famous educator herself, recalls the moments she first understood the concept of language. We walked down the path to a well house, attracted by the smell of honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelt into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew that water meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, and set it free. Language, the key to the world of culture, is a system of symbols that allows people to communicate with one another. So that is a definition term. Language, a system of symbols that allows people to communicate with one another. Humans have created many alphabets to express the hundreds of languages we speak. Several examples are shown in Figure 3.1. Even rules for writing differ. Most people in Western societies write from left to right, but people in Northern Africa and Western Asia write from right to left, and people in Eastern Asia write from top to bottom. Of the 7,000 languages in the world today, which language is spoken most widely? As Figure 3.2 shows, Chinese, including Mandarin, Cantonese, and dozens of other dialects, is the most widely used first language, meaning that it is spoken at home by some 1.2 billion people. English is the most widely spoken second language. It is used in most nations of the world, except for many nations in Western Africa and China. Language not only allows communication, but is also the key to cultural transmission, the process by which one generation passes culture to the next. So that is cultural transmission, the process by which one generation passes culture to the next. Just as our bodies contain the genes of our ancestors, our culture contains countless symbols of those who came before us. Language is the key that unlocks centuries of accumulated wisdom. Throughout human history, every society has transmitted culture by using speech, a process sociologists call the oral cultural tradition. Some 5,000 years ago, humans invented writing, although at that time only a privileged few learned to read and write. Not until the 20th century did high-income nations boast nearly universal literacy. Still, perhaps 10% of U.S. adults, in more than 20 million, are functionally illiterate and unable to read and write in a society that increasingly demands such skills. In low-income countries of the world, at least one-third of the adults are illiterate. Language skills may link us with the past, but they also spark the human imagination to connect symbols in new ways, creating an almost limitless range of future possibilities. Language sets humans apart as the only creatures who are self-conscious, aware of our limitations and ultimate mortality, yet able to dream and to hope for a future better than the present. Does language shape reality? Does someone who thinks and speaks in using Cherokee, an American Indian language, experience the world differently from a North American who thinks, say, in English or Spanish? Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf claim that the answer is yes, since each language has its own distinctive symbols that serve as building blocks of reality. Further, they noted that each language has words or expressions not found in any other symbolic system. Finally, all languages fuse symbols with distinctive emotions so that as multilingual people know, a single idea may feel different when spoken in Spanish rather than English or Chinese. Formally, the Sapir-Whorf thesis holds that people see and understand the world through the cultural lens of language. In the decades since Sapir and Whorf published their work, however, scholars have taken issue with this proposition. The widespread belief that, for example, Eskimos experience snow differently because they have many words for it is not true. Inuit speakers have about the same numbers of words for snow as English speakers do. So, how does language affect our reality? Current thinking is that although we do fashion reality out of our symbols, evidence supports the claim that language does not determine reality in the way that Sapir and Whorf claimed. For example, we know that children understand the idea of a family long before they learn the word. Similarly, adults can imagine new ideas or things before devising a name for them. Heading Values and Beliefs, page 67. What accounts for the popularity of Hollywood film characters such as James Bond, Neo, Aaron Brockovich, blah blah blah? Each is ruggedly individualistic. Going it alone and relying on personal skills and savvy to challenge the system. We are led to admire such characters by certain values. Values is defined as culturally defined standards that people use to decide what is desirable, good, and beautiful, and that serve as broad guidelines for social living. People who share a culture use values to make choices about how to live. Values are broad principles that support beliefs, specific thoughts, or ideas that people hold true to be true. In other words, values are abstract standards of goodness, and beliefs are particular matters that individuals consider true or false. For example, because most U.S. adults share the value of providing equal opportunity for all, they believe that a qualified woman could serve as President of the United States, as Hillary Clinton's presidential campaigns have demonstrated. Page 68, Key Values of Culture. Because U.S. culture is a mix of ways of life from other countries around the world, it is highly diverse. Even so, the sociologist Robin Williams Jr. identified 10 values that are widespread in the United States and viewed by many people as essential to our way of life. 1. Equal opportunity. Most people in the United States favor not equality of condition, but equality of opportunity. We believe that our society should provide everyone with the chance to get ahead according to individual talents and efforts. Number 2, achievement and success. Our way of life encourages competition so that each person's reward should reflect personal merit. A successful person is given respect due to a winner. Number 3, material comfort. Success in the United States generally means making money and enjoying what it will buy. Although we sometimes say that money won't buy happiness, most of us pursue wealth all the same. 4. Activity and work. Popular U.S. heroes, from tennis champions Venus and Serena Williams to winners of television's American Idols, are doers who get the job done. Our culture values action over reflection and taking control of events over passively accepting fate. Number 5. Practicality and efficiency. We value the practical over theoretical, what will get us somewhere over what is interesting for its own sake. Many young people hear their parents give the advice, it's good to enjoy what you study, but major in something that will help you get a job. Number 6, progress. We are an optimistic people who, despite waves of nostalgia, believe that the present is better than the past. We celebrate progress, viewing that the very latest is the very best. Number 7, science. We expect scientists to solve problems and improve the quality of our lives. We believe we are rational, logical people, and our focus on science probably explains our cultural tendency, especially among men, to look down on emotion and intuition as source of knowledge. Number 8, democracy and free enterprise. Members of our society believe that individuals have rights that governments should not take away. We believe that a just political system is based on a free election in which citizens elect government leaders and on an economy that responds to the choices of individual consumers. Number 9, freedom. We favor individual initiative over collective conformity. While we accept the idea that everyone has at least some responsibility to others, we believe that people should look out for themselves and be free to pursue their personal goals. Number 10, racism and group superiority. Despite strong ideas about equal opportunity and freedom, most people in the United States still judge individuals according to gender, race, ethnicity, and social class. In general, U.S. culture values males over females, whites over color, rich over poor, and people with Northwestern European backgrounds over those whose ancestry came from other parts of the world. Although we like to describe ourselves as a nation of equals, there is very little doubt that some of us are more equal than others. Heading: Values, often in harmony, sometimes in conflict, page 68. In many ways, cultural values go together. Williams' list includes examples of value clusters that are part of our way of life. For instance, we value activity and hard work because we expect effort to lead to achievement and success and result in greater material comfort. Sometimes, however, one key cultural value contradicts another. Take the first and last items of Williams' example. People in the United States believe in equality of opportunity, yet they may also look down on others because of their race or sex. Value conflicts cause strain and often lead to awkward balancing acts in our beliefs. Sometimes we decide that one value is more important than another. For example, supporting equal opportunity while opposing same-sex marriages. In such cases, people simply try to live with the contradictions. Values changes over time. Like all elements of culture, values change over time. People in the U.S. have always valued hard work, but as the U.S. population has become more diverse, more people wonder whether hard work is really enough to get ahead. For more people in all racial and ethnic categories, too, a single-minded focus on work is giving way to an increasing importance on leisure, having time off from work to do things such as reading, travel, or community service that provide enjoyment and satisfaction. Similarly, although the importance of material comfort remains strong, more people are seeking personal growth through meditation and other spiritual activity. Values, a global perspective on page 69. Values vary from culture to culture around the world. In general, the values that are important in higher income countries differ somewhat from those common in lower income countries. Because lower income nations contain populations that are vulnerable, people in these countries develop cultures that value survival. This means that if people place a great deal of importance on physical safety and economic security, they worry about having enough to eat and a safe place to eat at night. Lower income nations also tend to be traditional, with values that celebrate the past and emphasize the importance of family and religious beliefs. These nations, in which men have the most power, typically discourage or forbid practices such as divorce and abortion. People in higher income countries develop cultures that value individualism and self-expression. These countries are rich enough that most of their people take survival for granted, focusing their attention instead on lifestyle they prefer and how to achieve the greatest personal happiness. In addition, these countries tend to be secular rational, placing less emphasis on family ties and religious beliefs, and more on people thinking for themselves and being tolerant of others who differ from them. In higher income countries, too, women have social standing more equal to men, and there is widespread support for practices such as divorce and abortion. Heading Norms, page 69. Most people in the United States are eager to gossip about who's hot and who's not. Members of American Indian societies, however, typically condemn such behavior as rude and divisive. Both patterns illustrate the operation of norms, which are rules and expectations by which a society guides the behavior of its members. In everyday life, people respond to each other with sanctions, rewards, or punishments that encourage conformity to cultural norms. Heading Mores and Folkways. William Graham Sumner, an early U.S. sociologist, recognized that some norms are more important to our lives than others. Sumner coined the term mores to refer to the norms that are widely observed and have great moral significance. Certain mores include taboos, such as our society's insistence that adults not engage in sexual relations with children. People pay less attention to folkways, norms for routine or casual interaction. Examples include appropriate greetings and proper dress. In short, mores distinguish between right and wrong, and folkways draw a line between right and rude. A man who does not wear a tie to a formal dinner may raise eyebrows for violating folkways. If, however, he were to arrive at a party wearing only a tie, he would violate cultural mores and invite a more serious response. Heading Social Control. Mores and folkways are the basic rules of everyday life. Although we sometimes resist pressure to conform, we can see that norms make our dealings with others more orderly and predictable. Observing or breaking the rules of social life prompts a response from others in the form of reward or punishment. Sanctions, whether an approving smile or raised eyebrow, operate as a system of social control, attempts by a society to regulate people's thoughts and behavior. As we learn cultural norms, we've gained the capacity to evaluate our own behavior. Doing wrong, say downloading a term paper from the internet, can cause both shame, the painful sense that others disapprove of our actions, and guilt, a negative judgment we make of ourselves. Of all living things, only cultural creatures can experience shame and guilt. This is probably what U.S. author Mark Twain had in mind when he remarked that people are the only animals that blush or need to. Heading Ideal and Real Culture. Values and norms do not describe actual behavior so much as they suggest how we should behave. We must remember that ideal culture always differs from real culture, which is what actually occurs in everyday life. For example, most women and men agree on the importance of sexual faithfulness in marriage, and most say they live up to that standard. Even so, about 17% of married people report having been sexually unfaithful to their spouse at some point in their marriage. But a culture's moral standard are important even if they are sometimes broken, calling to mind the old saying, "Do as I say, not as I do." Heading: Material Culture and Technology. In addition to symbolic elements such as values and norms, every culture includes a wide range of physical human creations called artifacts. The Chinese eat with chopsticks rather than forks, the Japanese put mats rather than rugs on the floor, and many men and women in India prefer flowing robes to close-fitting clothing common in the U.S. The material culture of a people may seem strange to outsiders as their language, values, and norms. A society's artifacts partly reflect underlying cultural values. The warlike Yanomamo carefully craft their weapons and prize the poison tips on their arrows. By contrast, our society's emphasis on individualism and independence goes a long way towards explaining our high regard for the automobile. We own more than 250 million motor vehicles, more than one for every licensed driver, and even in an age of high gasoline prices, many of these are large SUVs we might expect rugged individualistic people to choose. In addition to reflecting values, material culture also reflects a society's technology, knowledge that a people use to make a way of life in their surrounding. The more complex a society's technology is, the more its members are able to shape the world for themselves. Advancements in technology have allowed us to crisscross the country with superhighways and to fill them with automobiles. At the same time, the internal combustion engine in those cars can release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which contribute to air pollution and global warming. Because we attach high importance to science and praise sophisticated technology, people in our society tend to judge cultures with simpler technology as less advanced than ours. Some facts support an assessment. For example, life expectancy for a child born in the U.S. is almost now 79 years. The lifespan of a Yanomamo is only about 40. However, we must be careful not to make self-serving judgments about other cultures. Although many Yanomamo are eager to acquire modern technology such as steel tools and shotguns, they are generally well fed by world standards, and most are very satisfied with their life. Remember too that while our powerful and complex technology has produced work-reducing devices and seemingly miraculous medical treatments, it has also contributed to an unhealthy level of stress and obesity in the population and created weapons capable of destroying in a blinding flash everything that humankind has achieved. Not mankind, humankind. Finally, technology is not equally distributed within our population. Although many of us cannot imagine a life without a PC, television, and smartphone, many members of U.S. cannot afford these luxuries. Others reject them on principle. The Amish, who live in small farming communities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, reject most modern conveniences on religious grounds. While their traditional black clothing and horse-drawn buggies, the Amish may seem a curious relic of the past, yet their communities flourish, grounded in strong families that give everyone a sense of identity and purpose. Some researchers who have studied the Amish have concluded that these communities are islands of sanity in a culture gripped by commercialism and technology run wild. Heading: New Information Technology and Culture, page 71. Many rich nations, including the United States, have entered a post-industrial phase based on computers and new information technology. Industrial production is centered on factories and machinery that generate material goods. By contrast, post-industrial production is based on computers and other electronic devices that create, process, store, and apply information. In this new information economy, workers need symbolic skills in place of the mechanical skills of the industrial age. Symbolic skills include the ability to speak, write, compute, design, and create images in fields of art, advertising, and entertainment. In today's computer-based economy, people with creative jobs are generally generating new cultural ideas, images, and products all the time. Heading Cultural Diversity, Many Ways to Life in One World. Discuss dimensions of cultural differences and cultural change. In the U.S., we are aware of our cultural diversity when we hear several different languages being spoken on the streets of New York or in a schoolyard in L.A., compared to a country like Japan, whose historic isolation makes it the most monocultural of all high-income nations. Centuries of immigration have made the U.S. the most multicultural of all high-income countries. Between 1820, when the government began keeping track of immigration, and 2014, more than 82 million people came to our shores. Our cultural mix continues to increase about 1.3 million people as about 1.3 million people arrive each year. A century ago, almost all immigrants came from Europe. Today, almost 80% arrive from Latin America or Asia. To understand the reality of life in the United States, we must move beyond cultural patterns and shared values to consider cultural diversity. As diverse as our country is, there are other countries where the experience of cultural diversity is even greater. Global Map 3.1 on page 72 shows the share of population born in another country for all nations of the world. High culture and popular culture, page 71. Cultural diversity involves not just immigration but also social class. In fact, in everyday talk, we use the term culture to mean art forms such as classical literature, music, dance, and painting. We describe people who go to the opera or the theater as cultured because we think they appreciate the finer things in life. We speak less kindly of ordinary people, assuming that everyday culture is somehow less worthy. We are tempted to judge the music of Haydn as more cultured than hip-hop, conscious couscous as better than cornbread, and polo as more polished than ping pong. These differences arise because many cultural patterns are readily available to only some members of society. Sociologists use the term high culture to refer to cultural patterns that distinguish a society's elite, popular culture to designate the cultural patterns that are widespread among a society's population. Common sense may suggest that high culture is superior to popular culture, but sociologists are uneasy with such judgments for two reasons. First, neither elites nor ordinary people share all the same tastes and interests. People within both categories differ in many ways. Second, do we praise high culture because it's inherently better than popular culture, or simply because its supporters have more money, power, and prestige? For example, there is no difference between a violin and a fiddle. However, we name the instrument a violin when it is used to produce classical music, typically enjoyed by a person of higher position, and we call it a fiddle when the musician plays country tunes appreciated by people with a lower social standing. We should also remember that our country's culture is made up of life patterns of all our people. What's more, this nation's culture is being created all the time, not just by those whose names are familiar to all of us, but also by countless people, including those living in some of the most disadvantaged neighborhoods of the country. Heading: Subculture. The term subculture refers to cultural patterns that set apart some segment of a society's population. People who ride chopper motorcycles, people who build their lives around yoga, Ohio State football fans, the Southern California beach crowd, Elvis impersonators, and wilderness campers all display subcultural patterns. It is easy but often inaccurate to place people in some subcultural category because almost everyone participates in many subcultures without necessarily having much commitment to any of them. In some cases, however, cultural differences can set people apart from one another with tragic results. Consider the former nation of Yugoslavia in southern Eastern Europe. The 1990s civil war there was fueled by extreme cultural diversity. This one small country with a population about equal to the LA metropolitan area used 2 alphabets, embraced 3 religions, spoke 4 languages, and was home to 5 major nationalities, and was divided into 6 political republics and absorbed the cultural influences of 7 surrounding countries. The cultural conflict that plunged this nation into civil war shows that subcultures are a source not only of pleasing variety but also tension and even violence. Many people view the U.S. as a melting pot where many nationalities blend into a single American culture. But given so much cultural diversity, how accurate is the melting pot image? For one thing, subcultures involve not just differences but also hierarchy. Too often we view that as dominant or mainstream cultures are pattern favored by powerful segments of the population, and we view the lives of disadvantaged people as subculture. But are the cultural patterns of rich skiers on the slopes of Aspen, Colorado, any less a subculture than the cultural patterns of low-income skateboarders on the streets of Los Angeles? Some sociologists therefore prefer to level the playing field of society by emphasizing multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is a perspective recognizing the cultural diversity of the U.S. and promoting equal standing for all cultural traditions. Multiculturalism represents a sharp change from the past when our society downplayed cultural diversity and defined itself primarily in terms of well-off European and especially English immigrants. Today there is a spirited debate about whether we should continue to focus on historical traditions or highlight contemporary diversity. E pluribus unum, the Latin phrase that appears on all U.S. coins, means out of many, one. This motto symbolizes not only our national political union, but also the idea that immigrants from around the world have come together to form a new way of life. But from the outset, the many cultures did not melt together as much as harden into a hierarchy. At the top were English, who formed a majority early in the U.S. history and established English as the nation's dominant language. Further down, people of other backgrounds were advised to model themselves after their betters. In practice, then, melting was a process of Anglicization, adoption of English ways. As multiculturalists see it, early in our history, this society set up the English way of life as an ideal that everyone else should imitate and by which everyone should be judged. In simple terms, culture can operate in support of social inequality. Ever since, historians have reported events from the point of view of the English and other people of European ancestry, paying little attention to the perspectives and accomplishments of Native Americans and people of African and Asian descent. Multiculturalists criticize this as Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism, the dominance of European, especially English, cultural patterns. Molefi Kite Asante, a supporter of multiculturalism, recalls that many 5th century Europeans believed that the earth was the center of the universe. Today, he continues, many people still consider European culture to be the center of the social universe. One controversial issue involves language. Some people believe that English should be the official language of the United States. By 2015, legislatures in 31 states had enacted laws making it the official language. But some 62 million men and women, 1 in 5, speak another language than English at home. Spanish is the second most commonly spoken language, and across the country we hear hundreds of other tongues, including Italian, German, French, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese, as well as the many Native American languages. National Map 3.1 shows where the United States large numbers of people speak a language other than English at home. And on that map, it seems mostly in Southern California, New Mexico, and the left side of Texas. Of more than 296 million people age 5 or older in the United States, the Census Bureau reports that 62 million, or 25%, speak a language other than English at home. Of these, 62% speak Spanish, 16% speak an Asian language. The map shows that non-English speakers are concentrated in these certain regions of the country. Which ones? What do you think accounts for this pattern? And the English-speaking states seem to be spread out in the middle, like southern states and anything above it, and Nebraska apparently. Anyways, going back to page 74, thinking about diversity, race, class, and gender, popular culture born in the inner city, the DJ scene, and the hip-hop music. Aaron Gerard O'Brien probably never thought he would help to change U.S. culture. In 1960, he was born into a social world where the odds were stacked against him. His family lived in a low-income African-American neighborhood in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Orphaned at 13, he moved in with his grandmother, who lived in the South Bronx, close to an intersection that was known for a gathering point for local gang members. In the 1970s, the South Bronx was brewing with social problems. As factories closed, the area lost thousands of good-paying manufacturing jobs. Unemployment and poverty were on the rise. Drug use, crime, and violence became every part of everyday life. Not surprisingly, AJ entered his teenage years thinking that violence was the way to express his frustration. He got into fights on the streets and at school to the point of being expelled for throwing another student through a window. His grandmother enrolled him at a local school for at-risk young children, but he found little to like in the classroom. Within a few years, he dropped out of school and began selling drugs, which earned him fast cash as he tried to stay one step ahead from the police. Like young people everywhere, AJ wanted to earn the respect of others. He also had a love for music. As the new DJ scene emerged in New York City in the mid-1970s, AJ was captivated by Africa Bambaataa, Grandmaster Flowers, and Pete DJ Jones. Perhaps most of all, he idolized a young DJ named Kool Herc. AJ remembers the first time he saw Herc. People in the Bronx were saying, "Yo, there's this dude named Herc, and this dude is crazy." He was sitting at the park on Sedgwick Avenue. So the next thing is I'm sitting there watching this dude, and he's drawing a crowd. AJ was hooked on this music scene and wanted to be part of it. AJ didn't know the first thing about DJing, but he hung out with other DJs. They became skilled at operating a turntable and playing records, figuring out which record to play and what part of the records people wanted to hear. And they developed a whole set of rules and conventions that would define the new DJ scene. In the summer of 1977, AJ did his first public performance in the local park. Although people from around New York had come to see the main act, a well-known DJ named Lovebug Starsky, there were also many people from AJ's community who showed up to see him. He knew he was starting to make it as a DJ. As his reputation spread, AJ lost interest in dealing drugs. He became a local hero, AJ explains. The guy who owns the stores close by the park would bring me beer or whatever. I wanted for doing my music because it attracted lots of people and made money for them. AJ's reputation continued to grow as he took part in battles, competitions between DJs not unlike the competitions for respect in gang culture. In a battle, DJs would play for an hour, switching back and forth. The DJ who succeeded in working the crowd into a frenzy was the winner. AJ's big break came as the result of a challenge to battle a DJ named Flash, the star of the South Bronx DJ scene, and to do it in Flash's territory. At first, AJ refused, thinking he would never hope to sway Flash's own neighborhood crowd. But his mentor, Lovebug Starsky, insisted, and AJ agreed. The night of the battle, more than 500 people packed into the Dixie Club in Flash's neighborhood. Even before the competition started, there were rowdy cheers for Flash. Seeing Flash haul in some new and expensive equipment further intimidated AJ as he began his set. He started with Groove to Get Down by T Connection, Catch a Groove by Juice, and Funky Granny by Kool and the Gang, rhythms that were funky and new to most of the audience. As he moved from one record to the next, the crowd began to groove with him. Then AJ pulled off a wild moment when Lovebug Starsky jumped onto the stage to rhyme with AJ's music. The crowd lost their minds. Flash followed with his own set, and he did his usual amazing work. The crowd cheered for their local DJ, but everyone knew that both men had put on very impressive performances. AJ had made it in the larger South Bronx DJ scene, a feat that would lead to opportunities that no doubt saved him from the dangerous social world of drugs and gangs that surrounded him. AJ and many other people like him did not make headlines in the New York papers, but they created the style of music performance DJing that is now popular on campuses across the United States. And the musical style that emerged from the movement, hip-hop or rap music, has become the most popular type of music among this country's young people. What do you think? Is the DJ scene part of popular culture or high culture? Why? What does this tell us about who creates new cultural patterns? Can you think of other cultural patterns that were born among low-income people? Going back to page 75, supporters of multiculturalism say that it is a way of coming to terms with our country's increasing social diversity. With the Asian and Hispanic populations of this country increasing rapidly, the U.S. Census Bureau predicts that by 2043, people of African, Asian, and Hispanic ancestry will be a majority of this country's population. Supporters also claim that multiculturalism is a good way to strengthen academic achievement of African American children. To encounter Eurocentrism, some multicultural educators call for Afrocentrism, emphasizing and promoting African cultural patterns, which they see as necessary after centuries of minimizing or ignoring the cultural achievements of African societies and African Americans. Although multiculturalism has found favor in recent years, it has drawn its share of criticism as well. Opponents say it encourages divisiveness rather than unity because it urges people to identify with their own category rather than the nation as a whole. In addition, critics say multiculturalism actually harms minorities themselves. Multicultural policies, from African American studies to all black dorms, seem to support the same racial segregation that our nation has struggled so long to overcome. Furthermore, in the early grades, an Afrocentric curriculum may deny children a wide range of important knowledge and skills by forcing them to study only certain topics from a single point of view. Finally, the global concern with terrorism has drawn the issue of multiculturalism into spotlight. In 2015, 2 Islamist terrorists attacked the offices of Charlie Hebdo, a French weekly satirical magazine, killing 12 people, including the paper's editor and a French police officer. As the attackers saw it, the paper had published material disrespectful of their religious beliefs. and in the following days more than 5 million people across France marched to denounce the use of deadly violence in responding to cultural affronts. Around the world, we now confront the challenge of being respectful of cultural differences while at the same time defending human life and the core cultural value of free expression of opinion. Some people believe that an extreme form of Islam is trying to impose itself on the relatively open and tolerant culture that exists in the Western high-income nations. There are also some people, both in the West and other parts of the world, who believe that the United States and other rich nations have imposed their way of life on others. In a world of cultural differences and conflict, we have much need to learn about tolerance and peacemaking. Heading Counterculture. Cultural diversity also includes outright rejection of conventional ideas or behavior. Counterculture refers to the cultural patterns that strongly oppose those widely accepted within a society. During the 1960s, for example, a youth-oriented counterculture rejected mainstream culture as overly competitive, self-centered, and materialistic. Instead, hippies and other counterculturalists favored a cooperative lifestyle in which being was much more important than doing, and the capacity for personal growth, or expanded consciousness, was prized over material possessions like homes and cars. Such differences led people to drop out of a larger society. Countercultures are still flourishing. At the extreme, small militaristic communities made up of people born in this country, or bands of religious militants from other countries exist in the United States, some of them engaging in violence intended to threaten our way of life. Heading Cultural Change, page 76. Perhaps the most basic human truth of the world is that all things shall pass. Even the dinosaurs, which thrived on this planet for 160 million years, exist today only as fossils. Will humanity survive for millions of years to come? All we can say with certainty is that given our reliance on culture, for as long as we survive, the human record will show continuous change. Figure 3.4 shows changes in attitudes among first-year college students between 1969 and 2013. Some attitudes have changed only slightly. Today, as a generation ago, most women and men look forward to raising a family, but today's students are less concerned with developing a philosophy of life and much more interested in making money. Change in one dimension of a cultural system usually sparks changes in another. For example, today's college women are much more interested in making money because women are now far more likely to be in the labor force than their mothers and grandmothers were. Working for income may not change their interest in raising a family, but it does increase the age of first marriage, the first childbirth, and the divorce rate. Such connections illustrate the principle of cultural integration, the close relationships among various elements of a cultural system. So there is a student snapshot. Compared to college students 45 years ago, today's students are less interested in developing a philosophy of life and more interested in making money. Researchers have surveyed first-year colleges every year since 1969. While attitudes about some things such as importance of family have stayed about the same, attitudes about other life goals have changed dramatically. Heading Cultural Lag, page 77. Some elements of culture change faster than others. William Ogburn observed that technology moves quickly, generating new elements of a material culture, which means things, faster than non-material culture, which is ideas, can keep up with them. Ogburn called this inconsistency cultural lag, the fact that some cultural elements change more quickly than others, disrupting a cultural system. For example, in a world in which a woman can give birth to a child by using another woman's egg, which has been fertilized in a laboratory with sperm of a total stranger, how are we to apply the traditional ideas of motherhood and fatherhood? Heading Causes of Cultural Change. Cultural changes are set in motion in three ways. The first is invention, the process of creating new cultural elements. Invention has given us the telephone, the airplane, the computer. Each of these elements of material culture has had a tremendous impact on the way of our life. The same is true of minimum wage, school desegregation, and women's shelters, each an important element of non-material culture. The process of invention goes on all the time, as indicated by thousands of applications submitted every year to the U.S. Patent Office. Discovery, a second cause of cultural change, involves recognizing and understanding more fully something already in existence, perhaps a distant star, or the foods of another culture, or women's athletic ability. Many discoveries result from painstaking scientific research, and others happen by a stroke of luck, as in 1898 when Marie Curie left a rock on a piece of photographic paper and noticed that emissions from the rock had exposed the paper and thus discovered radium. The third cause of cultural change is diffusion, the spread of cultural traits from one society to another. Because new information technology sends information around the globe in seconds, cultural diffusion has never been greater than it is today. Certainly, our society has contributed many significant cultural elements to the world, ranging from computers to jazz. Of course, diffusion works the other way too, so that much of we assume to be American actually comes from elsewhere. Most of the clothing we wear and the furniture we use, as well as the watch we carry and the money we spend, all have their origin in other cultures. It is certainly correct to talk about American culture, especially when we are comparing our way of life to the culture of some other society, but this discussion of cultural change shows us that culture is always complex and always changing. This Thinking About Diversity box on page 78 offers a good example of the diverse and dynamic character of culture and a brief look at history of rock and roll music. Turning to page 78. Thinking about diversity, race, class, and gender, early rock and roll, race, class, and cultural change. In the 1950s, rock and roll emerged as a major part of the U.S. popular culture. Before then, mainstream pop music was aimed at white adults. Songs were written by professional composers, recorded by long-established record labels, and performed by well-known artists such as Perry Como, Eddie Fisher, Doris Day, and Patti Page. Just about every big-name performer of the 1950s was white. At that time, the country was rigidly segregated racially, which created differences in cultures of white and black people. And in the subcultural world of African Americans, music had sounds and rhythms reflecting jazz, gospel singing, and rhythm and blues. These musical styles were created by African American composers and performers working with black-owned record companies, broadcast on radio to an almost black audience. Class 2 divided the musical world of the 1950s even among whites. A second musical subculture was country and western, a musical style popular among poorer whites, especially people living in the South. Like rhythm and blues, country and western music had its own composers and performers, its own record labels, and its own radio station. Crossover music was rare, meaning that very few performers or songs moved from one musical world to gain popularity in the other. But this musical segregation began to break down about 1955 with the birth of rock and roll. Rock was a new mix of older musical patterns blending mainstream pop with country and western, especially rhythm and blues. As rock and roll drew crowds drew together musical traditions, it soon divided society in a new way by age. Rock was the first music clearly linked to the emergence of a youth culture. Rock was all the rage among teenagers, but was little appreciated by their parents. Rockstars took a rebellious stand against adult culture, looked like what parents might have called juvenile delinquents, and claimed to be cool, an idea that most parents did not understand. Young people idolized performers sporting sideburns, turned-up collars, and black leather jackets. By 1956, the unquestioned star of rock and roll was a poor, white Southern boy from Tupelo, Mississippi, named Elvis Aaron Presley. With rural roots, Elvis Presley knew country and western music, and after moving to Memphis, Tennessee, he learned black gospel and rhythm and blues. Presley became the first super star of rock and roll, not just because he had talent, but because he had great crossover power, with early hits including Hound Dog, a rhythm and blues song originally recorded by Big Mama Thornton, and Blue Suede Shoes, written by country and western star Carl Perkins. Presley broke down many of the musical walls based on race and class. By the end of the 1950s, popular music developed into many new directions, creating soft rock, as represented by Ricky Nelson and Pat Boone, rockabilly, which is Johnny Cash, and dozens of doo-wop groups, both black and white. In the 1960s, rock expanded further, including folk music, the Kingston Trio, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Bob Dylan, surf music, which is the Beach Boys, Jan and Dean, and the British invasion led by the Beatles. Starting on the clean-cut pop side of rock, the Beatles soon shared the spotlight with another British band proud of its delinquent clothing and Street Fighter looks, the Rolling Stones. By now, music was a huge business, including not just the hard rock of Beatles and the Stones, but also softer folk rock performed by the Byrds, the Mamas and the Papas, Simon and Garfunkel, and Crosby, Stills and Nash. In addition to Motown, named after Motor City, Detroit, and soul music, launched by the careers of dozens of African-American stars, including James Brown, Aretha Franklin, the Four Tops and the Temptations, and Diana Ross and the Supremes. On the West Coast, San Francisco developed political rock, music performed by Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, and Janis Joplin. West Coast spin-off styles included acid rock, influenced by drug use, performed by The Doors and Jimi Hendrix. The jazz influence returned as jazz rock and was played by such groups as Chicago and Blood, Sweat, and Tears. This brief look at rock and roll shows the power of race and class to shape subcultural patterns. It is also that the production of culture becomes a mega business. Most of all, it shows us that culture does not stand but is a living process, changing, adapting, and reinventing itself over time. What do you think? Our way of life shaped rock and roll. In what ways did the emergence of rock and roll change U.S. culture? Throughout this period of musical change, most musical performers were men. What does this tell us about our way of life? Is today's popular music still dominated by men? Carry on the story of musical change to the present. Think of disco, heavy metal, punk, rock, rap, and hip-hop. Turning back to page 77, Ethnocentrism and Cultural Relativism. December 10, a small village in Morocco. Watching many of our fellow travelers browsing through a tiny ceramics factory, we have little doubt that North Americans are greatest shoppers. We delight in surveying hand-woven carpets in China or India, inspecting finely crafted metals in Turkey, or collecting the beautiful colored porcelain tiles we find here in Morocco. Of course, all these items are wonderful bargains, but one major reason for the low prices is unsettling. Many products from the world's low and middle income countries are produced by children, some as young as 5 or 6, who work long days for pennies per hour. We think of childhood as a time of innocence and freedom from adult burdens like regular work. In poor countries throughout the world, however, families depend on incomes earned by children. So what people in one society think of as a right and natural, some people elsewhere find puzzling and even immoral. Perhaps the Chinese philosopher Confucius had it right when he noted, "All people are the same, it's only their habits that are different." Just about every imaginable idea or behavior is commonplace somewhere in the world, and this variation from culture to culture causes travelers both excitement and, at times, distress. The Australians flip lights down to turn them on, North Americans flip them up. The British drive on the left side of the road, North American on the right. The Japanese give names to city blocks, North Americans give names streets. Egyptians stand very close to others when engaged in conversation. North Americans are used to maintaining several feet of personal space. Bathrooms lack toilet paper in much of rural Morocco, causing considerable discomfort for North Americans who recoil at the thought of having to the left hand for a bathroom hygiene, as some Moroccans do. Given that a particular culture is the basis for each person's reality, it is no wonder that people everywhere exhibit ethnocentrism, the practice of judging another culture by one's own culture, standards of one's own culture. Some degree of ethnocentrism is necessary for people to be emotionally attached to their way of life, but ethnocentrism also generates misunderstanding and sometimes conflict. Members of every cultural system tend to prefer what they know and are wary about what is different. The ancient Romans took this view of difference to an extreme, using the same word for stranger and enemy. Even language is culturally biased. Centuries ago, people in Europe and North America referred to China as the Far East, but this term, unknown to the Chinese, is an ethnocentric expression for a region that is far to the east of us. The Chinese name for their country translates to Central Kingdom, suggesting that, like us, see their own society as the center of their world. The alternate to ethnocentrism is cultural relativism, the practice of judging a culture by its own standards. Cultural relativism can be difficult for travelers to adopt. It requires not only openness to unfamiliar values and norms, but also the ability to put aside the cultural standards we have known for all our lives. Even so, people from different parts of the world come into increasing contact with one another. The importance of understanding other culture becomes even greater. As the opening to this chapter explained, businesses in the United States are learning the value of marketing to culturally diverse populations. Similarly, businesses are learning that success in the global economy depends on the awareness of cultural patterns around the world. IBM, for example, now provides technical support for its products using websites in 35 languages. This trend is a change from the past, when many corporations used marketing strategies that lacked sensitivity to cultural diversity. When translated into Spanish, Coors' phrase "turn it loose" startled Spanish-speaking customers by proclaiming that the beer would cause diarrhea. Braniff Airlines translated its slogan "Fly in Leather" so carelessly in Spanish that it read "Fly Naked." Similarly, Eastern Airlines' slogan "We earn our wings every day" became "We fly daily to heaven." Even poultry giant Frank Perdue fell victim to poor marketing when his pitch, "It takes a tough man to make a tender chicken," was transformed into the Spanish word reading, "A sexually excited man will make a chicken affectionate." But cultural relativism introduces problems of its own. If almost any kind of behavior is norm somewhere in the world, does that mean everything is equally right? Does the fact that some Indian and Moroccan families benefit from having their children work long hours justify child labor? Since we are all members of a single society, surely there must be some universal standard of proper conduct, but what are they? And in trying to develop them, how can we avoid imposing our own standards on others? There are no simple answers to these questions, but when confronting an unfamiliar cultural practice, it is best to resist making judgments before grasping what people in that culture misunderstand the issue to be. Remember also to think about your own way of life as others might see it. After all, what we gain most from studying others is better insight to ourselves. Heading: A global culture? Today, more than ever, we can observe many of the same cultural practices the world over. Walking the streets of Seoul, South Korea, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, Chennai, India, Cairo, Egypt, or Casablanca, Morocco, we see people wearing jeans, hear familiar music, and read ads for the same product we use at home. Are we witnessing the birth of a single global culture? Societies now have more contact with one another than before. thanks to the flow of goods, information, and people. 1. The global economy, the flow of goods. International trade has never been greater. The global economy has spread many of the same consumer goods from cars to TV shows to music and fashions throughout the world. 2. Global communications, the flow of information. The internet and satellite-assisted communications enable people to experience the sights and sounds of events taking place thousands of miles away, often as they happen. Cell phone communication instantly links people from around the world, just as technology enables text message to be written in one language to be delivered in another. In addition, although less than one-third of Internet users speak English as their first language, most of the world's web pages are written in English. This fact helps explain why, as we saw in Figure 3.2, English is rapidly emerging as the preferred second language around the world. 3. Global migration, the flow of people. Knowing about the rest of the world motivates people to move to where they imagine life will be better. In addition, today's transport technology, especially air travel, makes relocating easier than ever before. As a result, in most countries, significant numbers of people were born elsewhere, including more than 41 million people in the U.S., which is 13% of the population. These global links help make the cultures around the world more similar. Even so, there are three important limitations to the global culture thesis. First, the global flow of goods, information, and people is uneven in different parts of the world. Generally speaking, urban areas, center of commerce, communication, and people have stronger ties to one another, while many rural villages remain isolated. In addition, the greater economic and military power than North America and Western Europe means that these regions influence the rest of the world more than the rest of the world influences them. Second, the world culture thesis assumes that people everywhere are able to afford various new goods and services. As Chapter 12, Global Stratification explains, desperate poverty in much of the world deprives people of even the basic necessities of a safe and secure life. Third, although many cultural practices are now found in countries throughout the world, people everywhere do not attach the same meanings to them. Do children in Tokyo draw the same lesson from reading the Harry Potter books as children in New York or London? Similarly, we enjoy foods from around the world, knowing little about the lives of the people who created them. In short, people everywhere still see the world through their own cultural lenses. Heading: Theories of Culture, page 80. Apply sociological macro-level theories to gain a greater understanding of culture. Sociologists investigate how culture helps us make sense of ourselves in the surrounding world. Here we will examine several macro-level theoretical approaches to understanding culture, a micro-level approach to the personal experience of culture, which emphasizes how individuals not only conform to cultural patterns but also create new patterns in their everyday lives, is the focus of Chapter 6. Structural functional theory, the functions of culture. The structural functional approach explains culture as a complex strategy for meeting human needs. Borrowing from philosophical doctrine of idealism, this approach considers values the core of a culture. In other words, cultural values direct our lives, giving meaning to what we do and bind people together. Countless other cultural traits have various functions that support the operation of society. Thinking functionally helps us understand an unfamiliar way of life. Consider the Amish farmer plowing hundreds of acres on an Ohio farm with a team of horses. His farming methods may violate our cultural value of efficiency, but the Amish point of view, hard work functions to develop the discipline necessary for a highly religious way of life. Long days of working together not only make the Amish self-sufficient, but also strengthen family ties and unify local communities. Of course, Amish practices have dysfunction as well. The hard work and strict religious discipline are too demanding for some who end up leaving the community. Then, too, strong religious beliefs sometimes prevent compromise. Slight differences in religious practices have caused the Amish to divide into different communities. If cultures are strategies for meeting human needs, we would expect to find many common patterns around the world. Cultural universals are traits that are part of every known culture. Comparing hundreds of cultures, George Murdoch identified dozens of cultural universals. One common element is the family, which function everywhere to control sexual reproduction and to oversee the care of children. Funeral rites, too, are found everywhere because all human communities cope with the reality of death. Jokes are another cultural universal, serving as a safe means of releasing social tension. The strength of structural functional theory is that it shows how culture operates to meet human needs, yet by emphasizing society's dominant cultural patterns, this approach largely ignores the cultural diversity that exists in many societies, including our own. Also, because this approach emphasizes cultural stability, it downplays the importance of change. In short, cultural systems are not as stable or a matter of as much agreement as structural functional theory leads us to believe. Check your learning. In the United States, what are the functions of sports, July 4th celebrations, and Black History Month? Heading, page 81, Social Conflict Theory, Inequality and Culture. The social conflict approach stresses the link between culture and inequality. Any cultural trait, from this point of view, benefits some members of society at the expense of others. Why do certain values dominate a society in the first place? Many conflict theorists, especially Marxists, argue that culture is shaped by a society's system of economic production. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, Karl Marx proclaimed. It is their social being that determines their consciousness. Social conflict theory, then, is rooted in the philosophical doctrine of materialism, which holds that a society's system of material production, such as our capitalist economy, has a powerful effect on the rest of a culture. This materialist approach contrasts the idealist leanings of structural functionalism. Social conflict analysis ties our cultural values of competitiveness and material success to our country's capitalist economy, which serves the interests of the nation's wealthy elite. The culture of capitalism further teaches us that rich and powerful people work harder or longer than others, and therefore deserve their wealth and privileges. It also encourages us to view capitalism as somehow natural, discouraging us from trying to reduce economic inequality. Eventually, however, the strains of inequality erupt into movements for social change. Two historical examples in the U.S. are civil rights movement and the women's movement. A more recent example is Occupy Wall Street, which has focused on our society's increasing economic inequality. All these movements seek greater equality and all have encountered opposition from defenders of the status quo. Heading, Feminist Theory, Gender and Culture, page 81. As Marx saw it, the culture is rooted in economic production. Therefore, our society's culture largely reflects the capitalist economic system. Feminists agree with Marx's claim that a culture is an arena of conflict, but they see this conflict as being rooted in gender. Gender refers to the personal traits and social positions that members of a society attach to being female or male. From a feminist point of view, gender is a crucial dimension of social inequality, a topic Chapter 10, Gender Stratification, examines in detail. As that chapter explained, men have greater access to the workforce than women do, and so men earn more income. Men also have greater power in our national political system. For example, all 44 of this country's presidents have been men. In addition, on the level of everyday experience, men exercise the most power in the typical household. Feminists claim that our culture is gendered. This means that our way of life reflects the ways in which our society defines what is male as more important than what is female. This inequality is evident in the language we use. We tend to say man and wife, a phrase used in wedding vows. We almost never hear the phrase woman and husband. Similarly, the masculine word king conveys power and prestige, with a meaning that is almost entirely positive. The comparable feminine word queen has a range of meanings, some which are negative. Not only does our culture define what is masculine as dominant in relation to what is feminine, but also our way of life defines this male dominance as natural. Such a system of beliefs serves to justify gender inequality by claiming it cannot be changed. In short, cultural patterns reflect and support gender inequality. Cultural patterns also permeate this inequality to the extent they can carry it forward to the future. Evaluate. Social conflict theory suggests that cultural systems do not address human needs equally, allowing some people to dominate others. Marx focused on economic inequality and analyzed culture as an expression of capitalism. Feminists focused on gender and understand culture as a reflection of male domination. All these dimensions of inequality are built into our way of life. At the same time, such inequality also generates pressure towards change. Yet by stressing the divisiveness of culture, all social conflict analysis understate in which way cultural patterns integrate members of a society. Thus, we should consider both social conflict and structural functional insights for fuller understanding of culture. Check your learning. How might a social conflict analysis of college fraternities and sororities differ from a structural functional analysis? Heading: Sociobiology, Evolution, and Culture, page 82. We know that culture is a human creation, but does human biology influence how this process unfolds? A third way of thinking, standing with one leg in biology and one in sociology, is sociobiology, a theoretical approach that explores the ways in which human biology affects the way we create culture. Sociobiology rests on the theory of evolution proposed by Charles Darwin on the origins of the species in 1859. Darwin asserted that the living organism changed over long periods of time as a result of natural selection, a matter of four simple principles. First, all living things live to reproduce themselves. Second, the blueprint of reproduction is in the genes, the basic units of life that carry traits of one generation into the next. Third, some random variation in genes allows a species to try out new life patterns in a particular environment. This variation allows some organisms to survive better than others and pass on their advantageous genes to their offspring. Fourth and finally, over thousands of generations, the genetic patterns that promote reproduction survive and become dominant. In this way, as biologists say, a species adapts to its environment, and the dominant traits emerge as nature of the organism. Sociobiologists claim that a large number of cultural universals reflect the fact that all humans are a member of a single biological species. It is our common biology that underlines, for example, the apparently universal double standard of sexual behavior. As sexual researcher Alfred Kinsey put it, among all people everywhere in the world, the male is more likely than female to desire sex with a variety of partners. We all know that children result from joining a woman's egg with a man's sperm, but the biological importance of a single sperm and a single egg is quite different. For healthy men, sperm represent renewable resource produced by the testes throughout the most of the life course. A man releases hundreds of millions of sperm in a single ejaculation, technically enough to fertilize every woman in North America. A newborn female's ovaries, however, contain her lifetime supply of eggs. A woman generally releases a single egg from her ovaries each month. So, although men are biologically capable of fathering thousands of offspring, women are able to bear only a relative small number of children. Given this biological difference, men reproduce their genes most efficiently by being promiscuous, readily engaging in sex with any willing partner, but women look differently at reproduction. Each of a woman's relatively few pregnancies demands that she carry the child for 9 months, give birth, and provide care for years afterwards. Thus, efficient reproduction on the part of a woman depends on carefully selecting a mate whose qualities, beginning with the likelihood that he will simply stay around, will contribute to her child's survival and later successful reproduction. The double standard certainly involves more than biology and is tangled up with historical domination of women by men, but sociobiology suggests that this cultural pattern, like many others, has an underlying biologic. Simply put, the double standard exists around the world because biological differences lead women and men everywhere to favor distinctive reproductive strategies. Evaluate. Sociobiology has generated intriguing theories about the biological roots of cultural patterns. This approach, however, remains controversial for two reasons. First, some critics fear the sociobiology may revive biological arguments from over a century ago that claim superiority of one race or sex. But defenders counter that sociobiology rejects the past pseudoscience of racial and gender superiority. In fact, they say sociobiology unites all of humanity because all people share a single evolutionary history. Sociobiology does not assert that men and women differ biologically in some ways that culture cannot easily overcome. By far from claiming that males are somehow more important than females, sociobiology emphasizes that both sexes are vital to human reproduction and survival. Second, say the critics, sociobiologists have little evidence to support their theories. Research to date suggests that biological forces do not determine human behavior in any rigid sense. Rather, humans learn behavior within a cultural system. The contribution of sociobiology then lies in explaining why some cultural patterns seem easier to learn than others. Check your learning. Using the sociobiology approach, explain why a cultural pattern such as sibling rivalry, by which children in the same family often compete and even fight with one another, is widespread. Because any analysis of culture requires a broad focus on the workings of a society, the three theoretical approaches discussed in the chapter are all micro-level in scope. The applying theory table summarizes the main insights of each of these three approaches. The symbolic interaction approach, with its micro-level focus on behavior in everyday situations, will be explored in Chapter 6, Social Interaction in Everyday Life. Page 83, heading Culture and Human Freedom. Critique culture as limiting or expanding human freedom. This chapter leads us to an important question. To what extent are human beings as cultural creatures free? Does culture bind us to each other and to the past, or does culture enhance our capacity for individual thought and independent choice? Culture as constraint. As symbolic creatures, humans cannot live without culture, but the capacity for culture does have some drawbacks. We may be the only animal to name ourselves, but living in a symbolic world means that we are also the only creatures who experience alienation. In addition, culture is largely a matter of habit, which limits our choices and drives us to repeating troubling patterns such as racial prejudice and sexual discrimination in each new generation. Our society's emphasis on competitive achievement urges us towards excellence, yet this pattern also isolates us from one another. Material things comfort us in some ways, but divert us from the security and satisfaction that come from close relationships and spiritual strength. Culture as freedom. For better or worse, human beings are cultural creatures, just as ants and elephants are prisoners of their biology. But there is a crucial difference. Biological instincts create a ready-made world. Culture forces us to make choices, and as we make and remake a world for ourselves. No better evidence of this freedom exists than the cultural diversity of our own society and the even greater human diversity found around the world. Learning about this cultural diversity is one goal shared by sociologists. Wherever we may live, the better we understand the workings of the surrounding culture, the better prepared we are to use the freedom that it offers us. Page 84, Seeing Sociology in Everyday Life. This is the orange section. What clues do we have to a society's cultural values? The values of any society, that is, what that society thinks is important, are reflected in various aspects of everyday life, including the things people have and the ways they behave. An interesting way to read our culture's values is to look at the superheroes that we celebrate. Take a look at the characters in the 3 photos shown here, and in each case describe what makes the character special and what each character represents in cultural terms. So there's a photo of Superman, Captain America, forget her name, the woman from, I don't know, next.